In the previous video, we covered designating private IP address ranges for your VPC. In this video, we are going to continue our discussion of private IP addresses and the two types of public IP addresses you can use for your EC2 instances. We are also going to discuss elastic network interfaces, which are the virtual network cards attached to your instance. Every instance in your VPC must be placed inside a subnet. A random available private IP address from the subnet range is automatically assigned to each instance. Private IP addresses are not routable from the internet. If you want your instance to be reachable from the internet, then you will need a publicly routable IP address assigned to the instance's elastic network interface. There are two types of public IP addresses that can be assigned to your instance. AWS owns a large but finite number of public IP addresses. When you launch an instance, you can choose to have a public IP randomly assigned to it. You only need a public IP address if you want the instance to be reachable from the internet, so it is optional. When you create a subnet, which we will do later, you can set the subnet so that instances that launch in it will get a public IP automatically. However, when launching an instance, you can choose to override that and not receive a public IP. There is no cost for assigning public IPs to your instance. However, to follow best security practices, you shouldn't get a public IP for your instance if you don't need it. One of the nice features of EC2s are that you can stop them whenever you want to stop the billing. However, when you stop your instance, AWS will take back your public IP address. When you start your instance up again, it will be assigned a new public IP address, different from the original. This will cause a problem if applications that connect to your instance have hard-coded the old address. Also, you would have to update any DNS records that point to the old address. Even if you don't plan on stopping your instance, sometimes you have to if, say, the instance becomes impaired. To avoid this problem, AWS has a second type of public IP address known as an elastic IP. A public IP is given to an instance when you launch or start it, but an elastic IP is independent of the instance lifecycle. You can, at any time, ask for an elastic IP address. It is given to your account, not a specific instance. One of the great things about an elastic IP is that you can associate it with an instance that already exists, even if it is already running. And if you stop the instance, it does not become dissociated from the instance. So, you can freely stop and start EC2 instances with elastic IPs, and they will retain the same public address. By default, you can request up to 5 elastic IPs per region. If this isn't enough, you can request more by contacting AWS support. One elastic IP is free per instance. However, if your instance is not in the running state, you will be charged an hourly fee. So that means when you stop an instance, you will be charged a small fee per hour for the elastic IP that is associated with it. Also, if you have elastic IPs in your account that are not associated with a running instance, you will be charged. Each EC2 instance has one or more elastic network interfaces, or ENIs, attached, and the IP addresses are actually assigned to these. You can think of them as virtual network cards. Each instance has one ENI, designated ETH0, attached by default, known as the primary ENI. The IPs given to your instance at launch are assigned to the primary ENI. The primary ENI cannot be detached from the instance. However, you can create additional ENIs and attach them as secondary network interfaces to an instance. This doesn't increase the overall network capacity of the instance, but you can detach a secondary ENI and move it to another instance. This will actually move the IP addresses with it. So if you need to replace an impaired instance or just want to change it for a new type, you can launch a new instance and move the secondary ENI over from the old instance. This will move the associated IP addresses so you won't have to update DNS or application config files. An ENI will have one primary private IP address, and you can add one or more secondary private IP addresses. All of these would, of course, come from your subnet's CIDR block. You could choose to associate an elastic IP to each of the private IPs. However, only one elastic IP per instance is free. You will have to pay a small hourly rate for more than one elastic IP per instance. The regular public IP address is also a property of the ENI, but if you associate an elastic IP, the public IP will be returned to AWS. Security groups are also associated with the ENI and are not directly associated with the instance. Each ENI will have a unique MAC address. This is useful if you have a software license tied to a specific MAC address. If you want to move the application to a different instance, you can move the ENI and that will move the MAC address. Finally, ENIs have an attribute known as the source destination check flag. Enabled by default, this blocks network traffic that isn't destined for your instance. You can disable this check if you want your instance to do network address translation, routing, or to serve as a firewall. In this video, we covered the three types of IP addresses used for EC2s and the elastic network interfaces which hold the instance's network attributes for IP connections. In the next video, we will describe subnets in more detail and introduce route tables.